I'm assuming everyone, I'm not going to do a big synopsis of what I talked about in the keynote, but maybe I should just start with, if people have specific questions, just to start this with. Maybe just give you like, because sometimes people come into these workshops and say, I really had this is why I came here. So rather than me giving you a lot of useless stuff, why don't I start with what's perhaps most helpful, if there is a specific question, because otherwise I want to go into more of the clinical applications of these ideas. That's more the intention here. So if there's nothing in the chat itself, if that's okay, I'll just just let me know if there is something. Okay. So, well, essentially, then, if I was to just kind of take you through this, I get to see some pretty amazing programs all over the world. One of the ones that recently caught my attention was a program called Backtracks in Australia. They work with just really, young people who are not fitting in anywhere, often have precarious school careers, or trouble with the law, et cetera, et cetera. And what they've done is kind of cleverly, and again, in a culturally appropriate space, they've got these young, it's all young men, and they've gotten them involved with raising dogs. And then they do these there's a word for this, I can't remember what it is, but basically training a dog to go through an obstacle course. And the idea is, of course, that these young fellows have a responsibility for an animal, but they also have responsibility for the group. And it's a diversion because, of course, on the weekends when these competitions go on, they're with their dogs and the group going around the country or whatever, running the dogs through these courses. And it kind of brings them out of those patterns of gang involvement and other things that they may have been involved in. It's the dog, though, that's so critical, because it's actually, like, coming back to what I talked about earlier, it's that sense of I have a genuine responsibility for this animal. Also, the group acts as its own sort of moderator, that, if one person acts out or does something really mean or whatever, then it's the group that sort of sanctions their behavior. So because these are all older, these are 16 above. So the idea is that it offers these young men another aspect. And so if you begin to tick off the boxes on all the factors that we were talking about with resilience, like sense of relationships, powerful identity, opportunity to feel like you belong, opportunity to use your talents, fair treatment, it gives you a place to be, recreational opportunities. You begin to sort of tick lots of boxes, and you begin to see a program, in my estimation, good programs tend to allow you to intervene at multiple systemic levels at the same time. And so here, Backtracks is a simple example of that. Now, of course, finding the resources we need always depends on our social, built, or natural environments. And I think we know this, but we sometimes forget that so much of what makes us successful is not necessarily just intrinsically inside of us. It's what we have inside of us that has opportunities to be expressed. So one of the ways I like to show this is through the adverse childhood experience studies. I'm going to assume everyone in this room has heard of these 10 things that predict, the Kaiser Permanente, the original studies by Anda Felivi and others. And the idea is if you have these 10 things happen to you before your 18th birthday, even once, it predicts as an adult that you have things like, higher depression rates, this type of thing. Now, what's been interesting is, first of all, I'm going to go back here, sorry. All of those 10 things are not individually, like, you're not responsible for those individually, right? They all are affected by social policy, by environments, by the quality of our families, the way our courts sentence people, the way families deal with intimate partner violence, the way police respond. Like, all of this stuff is buffered by services, professionals, social policies, governments, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and yet I don't know Robert Anda and others really thought about it like that when they first started. And of course, I'm not sure if you've been following this, but the ACE studies have been criticized for not being contextual. So the Philadelphia ACE survey adds 5 new ACE factors into the mix. Have you ever witnessed violence? Did you ever feel discriminated against? Were there adverse neighborhood experiences? Were you bullied, or did you live in foster care as a child? And we now know that those, just like the original 10, add to your propensity to have a lifetime of other problems. So you get these kinds of graphs where you have, if you have a higher propensity for depression, et cetera, as your ACE score goes up. But the difference with a resilience conversation is, of course, I don't study the bottom of the bar graph. I don't really study why people develop depression. I study why 51% of people don't develop depression, even though they have a high ACE scores. And so then you get into more conversations like other people are doing things like Angela Nairanya and her colleagues in the US are talking about, say, benevolent childhood experiences. And what's really cool about these is we are now beginning to put together the sense that if you have these positive things happening, which again, really, if you think about it, that's the kinds of things that we do as programmers, if we can create programs and evaluate them and show they're effective, that actually give young people access to some of these things, then obviously they're going to buffer the impact of the ACE in our lives, in people's lives. So I'm not going to go through this. I went through this in my last slide, just in case people are joining. I just work from a principle of psychological resilience is our ability to navigate and negotiate for what we need in culturally meaningful ways. Now, the difference with this is I gave you a list of sort of 7 scientifically sound things, domains that we know predict resilience in my last presentation, because I was being the scientist as opposed to the clinician. But when I'm working more clinically, those ideas, found I could adapt into more of a sort of I'm a family therapist, clinical social worker by training. So I'm thinking about, how do you actually work with young people and their families and adults? And in terms of, at least with children, the list, there's 9 things that I keep seeing that appear as important things. And what's really neat about this, just like the benevolent childhood experiences, each of these 9 things can be affected by good programming. So if I might, obviously children need structure, they need consequences, they need to be, answerable for the kinds of mistakes they make, and hopefully can fix their mistakes when they can. They need strong parent-child, or at least some sort of caregiver relationships. They also need lots of other strong relationships, especially as we know that many times the children who are most in crisis have their parents are under a lot of stress as well. So it doesn't make sense to just download all the responsibility for attachment to those particular people. Children also need a powerful identity, something that they can, say about themselves. They need a sense of control, a sense of belonging, spirituality, a sense that their life has some sort of bigger purpose. They need a sense of their rights being respected and their responsibilities, and indeed they need to be safe and well supported. If I could, I can actually show you those, or one like what I find is I use the serum clinically. You can do that, the CYRM, but I find sometimes these sentence completion exercises are just as powerful when I'm actually thinking about a particular individual. So what I'm going to challenge you to do, just think about a particular child, young person, ideally, who maybe you've never really been able to help, or maybe that they've just not really been doing very well. And in a sense, diagnosing their resilience, I'd just like you to answer, see if you could fill in the blanks in the following questions. And what the idea here is the more blanks you fill in, the more likely the child has resources and capacities to cope with stressors in their lives. The ones that they can't fill in are probably good indications of programming that should supplement what they need. So there are people in my life who expect me to blank. Would the child be able, that you're thinking of, from their perspective, not yours, but from their perspective, would they be able to finish that sentence? When I don't meet expectations, I know that something will happen, and it actually happens. So there's a consistency there. And of course, they can fix their mistakes. It's under their control. I can reach out to my blank to get help when I need it. So there's an intimate or secure relationship somewhere. I feel respected for what's special about me when I'm with or at or doing, that there's some ability to cope in that particular way. In my blank, I get to participate in making decisions that affect my blank. So you actually have those opportunities. At my blank, people miss me when I'm not there. You generally know if you're sort of part of a community if someone notices that you're actually not there. Sense of culture, that when there are places such as blank where I can celebrate my culture and my beliefs, that's a very key factor. And in fact, there's a wonderful study done by Mark Lalonde and Chris Chandler on the west coast of Canada with Indigenous First Nations communities, or I think you refer to them as Native Canadians. And what they actually showed was that, I'm sure you have a bit of this in the United States, the rates of youth suicide are extremely high in those communities. But of the 196 communities that they looked at, the bands, half of them had no youth suicide, and some of the others, half, had astronomically high, some of the highest rates of suicide per capita in the world. So what distinguished the two groups? And what they found was that there was a constellation of 8 community-level factors which could distinguish communities that had youth suicide rates and didn't have youth suicide. And they were things like women participated in the governance of the community. They were things like whether or not there was a volunteer fire department, which you can imagine from a social cohesion point of view. There were things also like whether or not the community had a specially designated space for cultural activities. Not a gym at the school that was converted on the weekend for a powwow or something, but a designated space that had been purpose-built to celebrate people's culture. And this, in combination with other factors, seemed to have a profound impact on the rates of suicide in the community. Social justice appears as a theme. So, when I'm with others at my blank, I feel like I'm treated fairly, or when I'm with blank, I am responsible for myself and others, and I am well cared for by blank, and I feel safe when I'm with or at. So when you get all these factors together, you begin to sort of see some interesting patterns, right? So, you begin to see why refugees who come into a country and the children are parentified, meaning they take on adult roles when their adults are off at work or something. And often the child protection workers and others will have a problem with a 10-year-old coming home from school and cooking dinner for a younger sibling. But if you actually often ask the 10-year-old, what's it like for you doing that? They'll grumble a bit and say, oh, I wish I could go out and play with my friends. But they also will often talk about how that is a rite of passage and a recognition of their genuine contribution inside the family home. So they will feel actually that they're being treated fairly because the parents acknowledge the importance of the contribution the child's making. The identity that they get from those activities is quite powerful. And then along, often come people like me, social workers, and we say, oh, no, you can't have a 10-year-old cooking dinner for the younger ones. And then often it's the child themselves who resists that redefinition of the role in the family as well. So these are complicated, more contextually nuanced understandings of resilience. And when you begin to think about, what makes people resilient, and you begin to introduce culture and context, you get some very different ideas. Like, have you noticed, for instance, you never see a resilience measure, even ours, doesn't ask kids, how many languages do you speak, right? Because if you're dominant culture, dominant linguistic group, nobody ever thinks about, all the people at Harvard and other institutions who invented these measures, they were all dealing with a bunch of kids who could all speak English, right? So nobody had to ask them, how many languages do you speak? But if you imagine, if you work in places more like I work, which is more like, say, a refugee community, the number of languages and being bilingual or trilingual or more is incredibly powerful in terms of how much you're going to be able to cope with in terms of prejudice, stigma, racism, social isolation, loneliness, et cetera, et cetera. So things like, you could begin to see like bilingualism. Like, imagine we gave a test to kids all across the US, Canada, and said, well, how resilient are you? And we're going to give you a test and say, are you bilingual? And the kids go, oh, I'm not bilingual. So it's like, okay, so it's, oh my gosh, you're not resilient. Oh my God, your whole population is not resilient. And all the kids are refugees or from other countries or immigrants. They all score really high in this measure because, of course, they got questions that was actually tailored to their risk profile. And this then becomes the conversation to have. Let me give you a clinical example of this, and then I'll pause for questions as well. But these are training tapes affiliated with the book, Working with Children and Youth with Complex Needs, and they're based on real cases, but I just want to show you, this is a social worker, a colleague of mine, Allison Little, and she's going to be interviewing this young fellow named Brian, who lives in a homeless shelter. He's 16 years old. His dad is very violent. He had to leave home. his mom kind of defends the dad, whatever. And Brian, living in the shelter, has learning challenges, and he was caught carrying a knife to school, which normally triggers a suspension or an expulsion from school. Now, the problem is, if he gets expelled from school, he can't stay in the shelter. The shelter has a policy that the child staying in the shelter must be in school or working. So his carrying a knife to school causes a cascade of other risks and vulnerabilities. I just want to show you what a clinical interview using the principles that we're talking about here today of resilience actually begins to look like. And just notice the way Allison approaches this problem of the boy Brian taking the knife to school. And hopefully this will work.
The house.
The other thing that Ben did let me know was you got suspended for a day last week because you brought a knife to school. Can you tell me about that?
I guess when you state it like that, it does sound really harsh, but I mean, yeah, I don't know how to really explain it to a lot of people, because most people just come up to me and, well, they all see it, like, were you going to go stab somebody?
Okay.
And just, I've been asked to, like, someone picking on you, you're going to get back at them, that kind of thing.
Can you tell me a little bit more, Brian, by what you meant by bringing the knife, and like, just give me the details, because I don't really have a sense of, like, what is this knife and how come you had it? And what was that about?
It's just a little pocket knife, but I mean.
Okay. What's that knife mean to you? Is it something that you value?
No. A lot of people haven't, well, I include myself in that, just, you feel better, like safety.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah. I'm wondering if is it linked at all to those times that you told me about when we first met, about what was going on with your dad and when you saw your dad's violence? Were those times did you keep yourself safe somehow in those times?
I guess there were some situations like that. I mean, not recently. I mean, he's never around anymore.
Yeah.
He used to a lot more when I was younger, but at school, I too run into people like my dad a lot. I don't know, kids in the hall and stuff. I mean, well, if you're looking for an actual circumstance, like a concrete example like that, I mean.
Has there been any lately?
I don't know. If someone called me an idiot, it would just bring back days of my dad.
Right. If someone called you an idiot, or did someone call you an idiot?
Yeah, did.
Okay.
That's like the first one I can think of right off the bat, where it kind of triggers memories like that.
Yeah. Makes sense to me, right? Like,
yeah.
That's, something.
So it's an interesting clip in that Allison doesn't make the assumption that carrying the knife is dysfunctional behavior. In fact, in the context of where he's being triggered by memories of very severe abuse by his father, and kids are calling him stupid, which is always the trigger, and he does have severe learning challenges. You could see where the knife is more of a protective thing. He wasn't going to harm anybody. He was only going to defend himself. And it's that kind of more contextual notion of navigation to resources and negotiating for what's meaningful for you. So the intervention that flows is for the therapist to work collaboratively with the school, which is actually what happened here, to make sure that the school is safer and that the boy, in this case, could come to school 15 minutes later than the other kids and go to home 15 minutes earlier than the other kids to avoid confrontations on the playground. And this de-escalated the need for him to essentially do something as stupid as carrying a knife to school. We don't often think in those terms, right? Oh, categorical suspension, absolutely. The child then loses their shelter bed, they're on the street, they're homeless again, they're into a rougher crowd, they're trafficked or whatever. I mean, we don't think in these more complex systems with these kids. And this is what the magic of, I think, of resilience is that it gives us a frame to not so much ask, always, how do we explain the negative behaviors, always focus on the negative. Now we're looking at the functionality of why these behaviors might make sense, and then finding substitutes that give kids access to essentially answer those kinds of fill in the blank questions, or the serum if you prefer, in positive, socially desirable ways. When we get it right, we get it right. So coming back to this thing I presented earlier, I mean, basically good program design addresses more than one aspect of the scale. Like, I'm always amazed, you may have been hearing these studies which are now showing that our microbiome, John Crinan out of Ireland and others who kind of figured out these ideas that, anxiety increases in people with certain kinds of profile, where if your microbiome, the gut bacteria that you have, isn't sort of matched well to your body, you're more likely to have immune system responses that lead to anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, your gut bacteria is tied to your mood. It's a fascinating idea, but people who just think about that, the only solution then is that you give people macrobiotic or yogurt or something, is really missing the point. Is that, of course, it's also about food security. I mean, do you have shopping centers close enough to you that you can get good food? And indeed, you have a public transportation system that allows you to get to the grocery stores to buy the good food, to maintain an adequate diet, to actually bring down your levels of anxiety so that your immune system is functioning better because your microbiome is functioning better. In other words, how close the grocery store is and whether or not there's a good functioning public transportation system, which is subsidized for poor people, is actually part of the solution for a healthy microbiome. And that is sort of where resilience thinking and program development is actually going now. I think we're a long way from just thinking about, the one that used to always get me was earlier in my career is girl self-esteem workshops. Oh, let's all get the girls together at the school and give them a self-esteem workshop at noon hour, And it's like, okay, great. And it does almost nothing. The impact was like minimal to zero. But if you combine that girls self-esteem workshop at lunch hour with, say, an initiative where the girls take control and organize an event on International Women's Day in March, where there's a sense that group becomes a cohesive social collective, where it battles loneliness or faulty cognitions around gender. If it prevents those girls from having an early unplanned pregnancy, this time, if you begin to sort of broaden it out and the program ticks more of these different outcomes and they're relative to the risks the girls actually face, then your girl self-esteem workshop is actually going to do some good. But if it's just narrow on one aspect of a child's life, it probably is mostly not. And there's no evidence. I see very, very little evidence that those programs create long-lasting, enduring change. So, I guess what you're really looking at then is these kinds of eco maps. I described this in working with children and youth with complex needs, but essentially what you're talking about is trying to think of a child inside a weave. And if we were doing this live and with you, I can show you these weaves. I animate them live, but for the sake of this, I just want to show you a drawing of one. Is that, we want children to feel, strong, solid lines to supports of all kinds in their lives. And the squiggly lines represent conflicted relationships, resources that aren't functioning well for them. So you want to sort of sever those, or perhaps change a squiggly line into a solid line. And you want to create a strengthened ecosystem of different resources in a child, or indeed an adult's life as well. And the more you do that, it seems like the better we get at actually helping young people. If I could, best way I know how to, as a kind of a funny, here it is at the end of your day, I thought I'd just show you one last thing, I'll open this for questions, is, the story of Cinderella bothers me to no end. Cinderella's always told us the story of this, this kid who mother dies, father dies, has great personality somehow, ends up, having, whisked off to the palace, enchants the prince, turns a shoe, has the right size foot and everything, and somehow manages to capture the prince, right? And it's basically Meghan Markle's story, sort of thing, whatever. Anyways, but back to Cinderella. It pisses me off, by the way, that the story is always represented. First of all, by the way, my apologies for using the Disney picture, but that is the most common image we have of Cinderella. She's incredibly white. I mean, there's all kinds of racial bias in this particular portrayal of her, and not to mention the gender normative way that she's portrayed as a young woman. But pushing those stereotypes aside, even the other problem is, of course, that it's always about her. The story of Cinderella is not about Cinderella. It's about fairy godmothers. Let's face it. If I took the fairy godmother out of Cinderella, what do you got? Well, you got a kid who's being raised in an abusive home. Mother dies, father dies. She's kind of left with the evil stepmom. Poor stepmoms always get a bad rap, but what the heck? Evil stepsisters. She's being bullied and abused. She lives in this kingdom, and the only thing this stupid prince does is spend money on gala balls for the rich and famous, right? It's like, oh, we're going to spend all the gushing on money on the elites, the billion, everyone who's got some money, just keep gushing it on them, because God knows we're not going to pay any attention to the people who actually need health care and educate. There's not one social worker mentioned in Cinderella, ever. I've looked. Not once is a social worker or an education worker or anybody ever mentioned in Cinderella. So this kid probably turns 14 or 15, the kinds of kids I worked most of my career with, says to her stepmom, F you, I'm out of here. No fairy godmother to turn a pumpkin into a golden carriage. Kid ends up not in the palace, but behind the palace. And we know where the story goes from there. She's on the street, she's cold, she swaps sex for a place to stay, she ends up being trafficked, she's into drugs, alcohol, whatever else, right? I'm not trying to make flip, references here. But in a sense, the programs that we design and evaluate for their effectiveness, well, in a sense, we are fairy godmothers, or fairy godfathers, if you prefer, right? We are creating the conditions for resilience to flourish. And that is the dynamic of what actually creates the potential for well-being. So now that I've convinced you that you're all fairy godmothers or fairy godfathers, and maybe tantalized you with some examples, I have a few more things I can show you, but before I go any further with that, I'm curious, any questions, comments, feedback? I think we're only a dozen, 30 people here. So if you do have some questions or comments, jump in. I mean, just love to just respond and be more responsive to what would make this useful for you. You can either voice it, I think, right? You can just,
yeah. Folks should feel free to unmute and ask questions. I'll also keep watching the chat.
Yeah, or just if you want to put something into the chat, we can read it. I know I'm more of a chat writer than a voice person in the other roles. But.
I can jump in. I really appreciate this topic and what we're talking about. And I think it's really affirming some of the things that you're saying about culture and cultural identity. I think that there's been a push sometimes to not discuss culture in a very dynamic way. And this is just a good reinforcer that how we can think about incorporating culture into programs as a way to help with some of the sense of connection, and that can help in a both direct and indirect way with resilience. So I just really appreciate talking about that and making sure that we make space for that and just affirm that can be really powerful.
Oh, thanks. It's interesting. We just did a major study. I was partnered up with Cigna, one of the HMOs in the US, and we did a big study on youth during this period of the pandemic. And one of the interesting outcomes was we were measuring resilience in that population. And one of the interesting things that came out was that adults and kids who were in more diverse communities, whether that was partly a function of their school or workplace or just their broader community, the more diversity that they recorded in those communities, the higher their resilience scores. And it seemed like the less anxiety and other sort of psychological problems that they were having. In other words, there's something about this plurality of cultures colliding and people drawing from each other, interesting resources that actually, a very practical, it wasn't a finding that they were, definitely predisposed to look for, but it came out quite strongly. I know that we're having a big debates about immigration and refugees and everything else. And I think what people are kind of missing the fact is that this diversity that we're so sort of hesitant about is actually the strength of communities. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking as a scientist here on this one, that by nurturing that, there's a net benefit. And there's other data on, if you want to look at the income levels of refugees post-settlement and stuff like that, they are after about 2 generations or 20 years, you tend to see a net gain economically for the host communities. In other words, they're money makers, I guess. You got to be super crass these days, right? You can't just do the humanitarian thing and bring in refugees. No, you have to say, and we'll also economically boost our economy 20 years down the line, sort of thing, and have a net gain. Anyways, politics aside on that, programs that then are attuned to cultural differences and perhaps create some space for heterogeneity, diversity, seem to actually be onto something quite good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Do people have examples of particularly effective programs that you're running that reflect some of these principles in navigation, negotiation, resilience? I know sometimes this feels like a very one way, but I'm really always learning. I'm always keen to. If someone has a good story, I'm keen to hear it. Something working, right? Or as I say, or just a question. I can present a little bit. I have a little bit more content. So maybe that will stimulate. Maybe I'll just go another couple of minutes here. Would that be?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me? Hello?
I sure can. Who's speaking? What's your
Anne
first?
from Michigan State University. I do a program working with the families that are been affected by the water crisis, the lead crisis, and talking about half of our curriculum, we talk about the lead and how it affects the executive functions, which affect their schooling. We always then have a conversation about IEPs. And so coming from an education background, 10 minutes of my class then is teaching the vocabulary of that culture, of the school culture, of what terms you need to use to get the child to receive some services. Because you can't just go and say, oh, this is what's happening. There's steps, there's note taking, and so that I can see as being part of a culture that is not usually addressed.
I love your example because one of the other big parts of the work I do is talking about advocacy as one of these kinds of clinical skills that we sometimes forget about, giving people new words or new languages to express or to describe their what they're experiencing, whether it's sexual harassment or violence or a form of marginalization or oppression. I mean, we don't tend to, those words are powerful if you give those things to people to use. And I love what you're saying. You're basically helping people to self-advocate with the right language so that the people who are the gatekeepers to those services can't ignore them. If you come in and say, my child needs an IEP for this particular condition, it's really hard to say that the request was not forthright and demanded. That's a brilliant strategy, by the way. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can jump in here real quick. You asked for an example of a program. So this is Ron from Oklahoma State. So yeah, this kind of, I think, adds a little bit of fuel to your fire here. We run a program where we work kind of with multiple systems where we focus on the parents, on the youth agency, and also the peer group kind of simultaneously. But our focus is academic achievement. That's our outcome. However, we're submitting a paper right now where we show pretty strong effects on substance abusing behavior over 4 years. So, in other words, longitudinally following these kids, from the 7th grade through the 10th grade, there's no significant increase in substance abusing behavior, which is pretty stark if you know the literature, and the trends are pretty steep from 7th grade to 10th grade. So I guess my point is kind of reinforcing what you're talking about, is that our program doesn't focus on substance abuse, doesn't even mention substance abuse, but it focuses on positive youth development and on putting some of these structural pieces in place that help youth overcome the natural adversity in their environments, and then that filters down into their decision-making process, and they have a sense of belonging with a pro-social peer group, and et cetera, they start moving on their own towards positive outcomes and towards a successful, happier future. So anyway, I thought that kind of maybe dovetails a little bit into what you're saying, where it's not necessarily focusing on an outcome, but it's focusing on these antecedents that build the youth's ability then to manage on their own the natural adversity that's in all of our lives. I mean, everyone has adversity. It's building the wherewithal to adapt to your environment and be an overcomer. So anyhow, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
And it's interesting that you're hitting, and I just brought this back up because it's like you're addressing, I love that example because you're addressing other systems. You said the parents, the peers. It's like, sometimes the outcome you want, if you just, and this is sometimes the critique of resilience, that if all you did was focus on the individual child, then all the responsibility for change is on the child's shoulders or that particular one individual. And that's a heavy burden for change. Whereas if we can create environments that nudge people towards their best selves, it's quite an effective strategy, but not one that we seem to, we don't necessarily talk about it quite enough, do we? That's really cool. Yeah. That's really interesting. Other questions or comments on that? That's a really good example. Well, again, maybe in the interest of having some fun with this, I was talking about differential impact earlier today, and again, it's interesting. Programs that mentor youth usually should have a positive impact, right? And they mostly do. If you look at this study by Yu Young Kwok and their colleagues, they found that, yeah, I mean, no surprise, on the whole, if you provide children with a mentor in a group setting, like a choir at a church or some sort of community scouting program or whatever, generally speaking, abused kids show a decline in depressive symptoms, except for sexually abused kids. And this is very interesting. The sexually abused kids in this particular sample got worse on depression. And in fact, when they continued to look at their data and disaggregated, and we did this as part of a special issue of Child Abuse and Neglect, a colleague of mine, Linda Theron and I, and it was interesting that here, the children who had been sexually abused actually declined in their delinquency. So they went up in depression, but down in delinquency, while the children who had been more emotionally neglected in that sample actually became more delinquent as a consequence, potentially, of the mentorship group that they were receiving. These patterns are not definitive, and they need further investigation, but it is interesting that our group interventions, our interventions with kids are going to be meaningful in different ways for different kids, depending on how, where they're coming from in their past and their resources that they have, et cetera, et cetera. And the one other example I've been lately really giving is this is Canadian data, but the US data is very, very similar. We're seeing a huge spike in emergency room visits and hospitalizations for children showing up with mental disorders, mostly depression and anxiety. And at a time when hospitalizations are declining for all other disorders with children, broken bones, et cetera, kids' mental health problems are increasing and putting them in hospitals. And it's been speculated that some combination of cell phone technology and constant comparisons with others and sort of social dynamics, as well as overprotective parenting, is disadvantaging our kids in some really serious ways. So then we begin to think about interventions. I'll give you an example of programs. Summer camps, where I am at least, have changed the way they offer programming during the summer camps. Not this past summer, but normal summers. And one of the changes was they used to get kids, you'd go to camp and you were programmed because, wow, you go to boating and then you go to the gym and then you do this and then you go your hike and then but now they found that what most kids want is they want some programming, but they also have open afternoons in their schedule. So the kids can just sit down and do nothing. Because the one thing that kids aren't allowed much in our society anymore is by hyperactive parents who have them enrolled in every single activity, overprogrammed, and they're constantly sort of under the pressure. So kids actually, summer camp is just an opportunity maybe to do a little bit of nothing. And so this whole notion of, say, if you're, overprotective parenting becomes a risk factor for some kids in communities that might have material well-being, but are emotionally in a deficit, So you begin to sort of see where even something like overprotective parenting is a unique risk factor. If you look at, say, Sunia Luther's work in the US, where she worked almost exclusively and studied resilience of kids in families where the mean income was the household family income was $300,000 or higher. So what she was looking at, that sort of push for overachievement, high expectations, and those kinds of things produce a lot of stress on kids as well, which demand a different kind of programming than obviously children, most of the examples I've given up to now, like the gang prevention programs and youth prevention programs and that type of thing. So you kind of get this need for something quite different. Yeah, I'm not going to show you this, but if I could show you this for a second. This is from, I just make you laugh here for a second. I'm just going to show you a couple minutes of this. I think you'll quite enjoy it. This is definitely the antidote to overprotective parenting and institutions that are harming our kids and making them more anxious by never letting them actually do things that kids should be doing.
Here on the outskirts of Auckland, students as young as 5 do whatever they want in the playground. They roam around with no shoes, but plenty of homemade weapons. They climb as high as they can, and often higher. Not in secret, but blatantly, proudly. These kids don't care who sees.
And there's basically no rules. Yeah, there's no rules, basically.
Before school, the kids make the rules.
Right, yeah.
But in the 2 40-minute play sessions after forced food breaks, anything goes. Are you scared?
I just love that because it just shakes us out of our complacency. That reminds us, and there's actually good studies that show that children left to do those kinds of things are less likely to injure themselves, actually. That when we create that constant surveillance of children, they actually don't know how to self-regulate. They don't know actually how to keep themselves safe, and they're more likely to have injuries later in life, or on the work site or on the job site. So as crazy as that looks, we're kind of letting lawyers raise our kids right now, aren't we? We're saying because of that, that expectation that they could get hurt, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just kind of more of thinking about, that maybe we just need to sort of do this ever so, just a little bit differently. If I could, I just wanted to sort of, in summary, I bring a little bit extra material for these workshops, but I will just kind of show you. I just wanted to go through one last little slide here. One of the outcomes of all this has been a program that we've been developing called R2, which is just building, we're trying to get this idea that you build rugged qualities and you build resources around people. And we've been we've actually been developing this and testing this as our own little pilot intervention to see whether or not this would actually embellish resilience, using measures like the serum to do so. But the point is that, whether, this whole notion that you thinking about developing the capacity, individual capacity, and the resources to actually do well. Any last comments or questions before I sign off here? Just take care. Do stay in touch. I'm easy to find out by email as well. Very, very simple.
I was going to comment on when you were talking about the study with Sigma, and talking about the resilience of plural societies, communities, which I'm very much in favor of, right? I come from a very pluralistic family in many ways. But when you were making those comments on the difference between kids who were from more affluent communities versus kids who were from less affluent communities, what came into my mind was what you were just talking about, is the overperforming, the high expectations of parents create stress. Those kind of parents often are not used to spending lots of time with their kids because they're always shipping them out to different kinds of programs that they can afford, right? And now all of a sudden these families find themselves locked in a house, spending lots of time together, parents worried about their kids' performance, their kids' future, et cetera, right? All of this stuff is happening where the low or less affluent communities are saying, you know, it'll, whatever happens, happens kind of thing. There's a more fatalistic type mindset among a lot of lower income communities, more collectivistic kind of society or outlook on things. And that kind of stress of the overperforming parent is not so present. They just kind of take things in stride. And so I don't know if it's the pluralism per se, but kind of the cultural mindset that comes along with, I hate to say lower expectations, but they're probably normal expectations as opposed to overly excessive or oppressive even expectations that many of today's parents put on their children.
I don't know. Those two studies were quite separate. I didn't want to imply that they're the same group. Two very different bodies of research that I took, but I hadn't actually thought about putting those together. Yeah, anyway, I don't know. The data will have to tell whether or not parents with lower economic conditions have less expectations. It might be. I think it's just going to be different expectations maybe of the kids. But yeah, you know, these are all stereotypes as well, because of course we know there's a range of different experiences. I certainly wouldn't want to make that dichotomy. We do though have a bias. I think my point was more that we sometimes overlook the stressors that are specific to wealthy families, and that's what Sunia Luthers does. That's not my work, but that's her work. And it's an interesting conversation. Whether or not it holds up to be true is a question, but certainly we do know that overprotective parenting, that pattern of parenting, wherever it occurs, does have some consequences long term. So I'll leave it at there and simply say huge thanks. Thanks for listening and all the best with your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ungar. And I put a link in the chat. We are having a little wrap-up session for grantees. If you follow that link back to the plenary Zoom room, Dr. Danny and Lynn are going to wrap things up. So thank you.